I'm a huge Buckeye fan. If you have a nice jersey, I can help you recruit. Please get these ladies paid. We're going to do what we want, and you're going to have no choice but to respect it. So basically, the NCAA was saying you can't benefit off of your athletic reputation, but we can. Welcome back to the 5 Seconds on the Clock podcast with your boy Brandon Williams. And today I'll be giving my reaction to the initial college football playoff rankings. I'll be previewing some big Week 11 matchups. And I'll also be giving some possible scenarios as we head into the tail end of the college football season. But first, I don't know if I ever explained why I named my podcast the 5 Seconds on the Clock podcast. But the inspiration behind the name, I was trying to think of something that could tie into sports, something that really is universal to all sports, because I wanted to talk about not just one or two specific sports, but really everything that encompasses sports. So I was thinking, and I came up with 5 seconds on the clock because when there's 5 seconds on the clock in any sport, if it's any, big situation, any leverage moment, when there's 5 seconds on the clock, you want that ball in that one person's hand who's going to make something happen. And basically, it's 5 seconds on the clock. Are you going to fold under the pressure, or are you going to rise to the occasion and make a name for yourself? We know legends are made in big time moments, big time games with the clock running down. What you going to do? You going to make the most out of it? You going to rise to the occasion, or are you going to fold? What do you want your legacy to be? The last 5 seconds of a game can determine how we look at a player and what their legacy is in our eyes. So that's the inspiration behind the name of the podcast. But now, let's get straight to the discussion. So the initial college football playoff rankings were released on Tuesday night, and some people were surprised the committee left Clemson out of the top 4, electing to go with Penn State instead. And others were surprised that Ohio State was number 1 instead of LSU, who has the 2 most impressive wins of the season so far. So Clemson at number 5. Why is Clemson at number 5? Well, Trevor Lawrence did come out the gate slow after the impressive performance he had in the college football playoff last season, where he threw for over 300 yards against Notre Dame and Bama, and ultimately won the national championship with a 44-16 win, dominant win over Alabama. But this season, he came out the gate slow. He only had 4 interceptions all of last season, and early in the season, he was throwing a bunch of interceptions, and I think he's up to 8 right now. And Clemson also struggled against some competition that you think they should blow out. Specifically, North Carolina. They only beat them by 1. And if North Carolina would have elected to kick the field goal, that game could have went to overtime, and we don't know what would have happened. But they did try the 2-point conversion, and Clemson stopped them. So Clemson still undefeated, still 8-0. Still in a good position. All they have to do is win out, really. But they haven't played any really strong competition. They had Texas A&M at home. Texas A&M was in the top 25 of the AP poll at that time, but they took care of business and beat them. But other than that, a lot of people were arguing that they don't have a tough schedule. So really, they're going to be able to just run their way, run the table, and get to the college football playoff regardless, because the ACC is one of the weaker, if not the weakest, Power 5 conference right now in the NCAA. But regardless, like I said, they have the opportunity to run the table. All they have to do is take care of business. No matter who's in front of them, what people say, all they have to do is go out there on the field and beat the teams that are in front of them. So that's Clemson. So why Penn State at number 4? Well, they do have 2 top 25 victories. They beat Michigan and Iowa. Michigan is currently ranked number 14 and Iowa's number 18. So those are 2 impressive wins for Penn State so far. And they have taken care of business versus teams they should beat. They have a big test coming up this week. Well, we'll see if it's really a big test. Minnesota is undefeated and is 8-0 thus far into the season. They're ranked number 17 in the college football rankings. But we'll see if Minnesota is actually that good this week. If you look strictly at the eye test, Ohio State has been the best, most dominant team in the country on both sides of the ball. I don't think there's any argument when it comes to that. But when you look at LSU's schedule and the wins they have, LSU has wins over Texas. I know that's not as sexy as a win as it was back then when Texas was ranked number 9. It was a top 10 matchup in Austin, but regardless, LSU went in there. Like I said, top 10 matchup, handled business, got that victory. Joe Burrow was impressive, had 371 passing yards, and he really boosted his Heisman candidacy then, and that's when people really started talking about Joe Burrow as a Heisman candidate. They also beat Florida. Florida right now is ranked number 10 in the college football playoff rankings. That's a top 10 win for LSU. They also beat Auburn, who's right behind Florida at number 11. Two top 15 victories. The two most impressive wins of any team thus far. So a lot of people are saying with their resume, the wins they have on their schedule, LSU should be number one over Ohio State. But if you look at the eye test, people are saying Ohio State has looked like the best team, no matter who they're playing, no matter if they haven't had as tough of a schedule as LSU has. When you watch the games, Ohio State has been the best team on both sides of the ball. Now let's talk about some other conferences. Assuming the ACC, Big Ten, and SEC get one team in the playoff, does the Big 12 or Pac 12 deserve the fourth and final spot? Now let's talk about the Big 12. Oklahoma controlled its own destiny until the 7-point loss at Kansas State. Jalen Hurts is still putting up Heisman numbers, putting up video game-like numbers. The defense was improving in the beginning of the season. They looked better than they have in years past until that Kansas State game. They were exposed. But if Oklahoma can run the table, beat Baylor, who's right now undefeated, and win the Big 12, and they are the conference champ, should they be in? Let's now make the argument for the Pac 12. You have Oregon and Utah, who are both in prime positions to make the playoff if they win out. Both teams have one loss, but if one of those teams can win out and they will meet in the Pac 12 championship, the winner could be on its way to the playoff. Or does the Big 10 or SEC get more than one team and both the Big 12 and Pac 12 get left out? Let's discuss how the SEC could get two teams in. So, as you know, this week, LSU versus Bama in Tuscaloosa, number 2 versus number 3, big game. People are calling it the game of the century, but really, every time there's a big matchup every year, like a top 3, top 5, or maybe 1 versus 2 matchup, people call it the game of the century. So I think that's way overused. But that's what people are calling it, so we're going to go with that. The loser of the LSU versus Bama game could potentially still make the playoff if it only has one loss, even though it wouldn't play in the SEC championship game because Bama and LSU are both in the SEC West, so whoever wins the division will be in the SEC championship game, and the other team will be at home watching. But the loser of that game could still make it to the playoff. Say LSU wins, they run the table, and they win the SEC championship game over, say, Georgia. Can Alabama still get in? That's a possibility. A couple years back, Auburn beat Alabama. They represented the SEC West in the SEC championship game. They lost to Georgia. Georgia made it to the playoff, but Alabama was able to get in there as well as the number 4 seed. Another way the SEC could get two teams is if the winner of the LSU versus Bama game runs the table and then loses to Georgia in the SEC championship game. Now, it would be interesting to see if the committee would put a one-loss SEC team that just lost the day before, because the SEC championship game were all conference championship games, on the Saturday before the Sunday selection show, where we find out who the top 4 teams are. So if they lose the day before, is the committee willing to put that team in over, say, a one-loss Pac-12 champion who just won the day before? Just saying that out loud makes it seem totally crazy, but we never know with the committee. We never know what they think and what they value. I think if that situation were to present itself and Oregon only has one loss and is the Pac-12 champ, they should get in because it only has one loss and it is a 6-point loss versus Auburn week 1 on a neutral site. And we can't hold that loss against the Ducks and praise LSU for the win against Auburn. Say the loser of the LSU versus Bama game wins every other game except that game, and the other team loses to Georgia in the SEC title. Does the loser of the LSU versus Bama game have a shot to get in? It's certainly interesting to speculate and debate the possibilities, but we'll see what the committee does, and we'll see how the season unfolds. Now to the Big Ten. Could they get two teams in the playoff? The loser of the Ohio State versus Penn State game, assuming Penn State takes care of business versus Minnesota Saturday, could possibly get in, and like the loser of the LSU versus Bama game, the loser of the Ohio State versus Penn State game would not play in the Big 12 title. The Big 10 title. But the Ohio State versus Penn State game is the second to last week of the regular season, so maybe that loss will be too late into the season and virtually eliminate the loser. But maybe not, because in all likelihood, it will be a top 3 matchup because the loser of the LSU Bama game would at least slide below Penn State and Clemson, I would assume. That's the only way I can see two Big Ten teams getting in, is if the loser of the Ohio State versus Penn State game, somehow finds a way to still get in. But whoever wins that game has to run the table for the loser of that game to get in. That's the only way I can see that making sense in the Big Ten getting two teams into the college football playoff. But let's preview some big Week 11 matchups. We got some big matchups coming up this week. Of course, the headliner, we already talked about it. Bama versus LSU. Joe Burrow versus Tua. We all know they're both Heisman candidates. Right now, you have to give the edge to Joe Burrow just because of Tua's health. He did miss one game. Burrow's been there every game. He's performed well, put up big numbers, especially in the big time games. So you'll have to give the edge to Burrow right now. But that's going to be a big game. Neither one of these defenses are what we historically know them as. We know Bama and LSU have always having big time defenses. Of course, Bama last year, their offense caught up. We saw what Tua did, put up big numbers. To begin this season, they were doing the same thing. LSU had defense for years, had great wide receivers for years, but the quarterback play was behind. But now Joe Burrow is there, and he's doing great for that offense. Joe Brady came over from the Saints in the offseason, and that LSU offense went to another level. I think they're still averaging over 50 points a game. Now, they did have the low scoring affair versus Auburn, but that Auburn defense is no joke, especially that front seven. That D line is the best in the country. Nobody can doubt that. But regardless, this is a highly anticipated matchup. 2 versus 3. How can you not love this as a football fan? I'm interested to see what happens. I'm leaning towards LSU just because of the health of Tua. And like I was saying, Bama's defense is not what it was in years past. They're a young defense. They don't have experience like they had before. They lost Dylan Moses at the beginning of the year. He's going to be out for the whole season. So that's been tough for them. But I'm leaning towards LSU. I'm going to go with LSU to win that game down in Tuscaloosa. Also, in the Big Ten, you have number 4, Penn State versus number 17, Minnesota, a matchup of two undefeated Big Ten teams. Minnesota has been a bit of a surprise this season, but you could argue they haven't really played anybody either. They've had an easy schedule, so they've been able to run the table until this point. And Penn State, they've looked impressive. Like I said, they have the two big wins versus Michigan and Iowa, so you can't argue that they really haven't played anybody. Outside of that, maybe, but still, they took care of business. They just played the people that's in front of them, and they won every time. But that's not the only big matchup in the Big Ten. Number 13, Wisconsin hosts number 18, Iowa and Madison at Camp Randall. This is a big matchup in the Big Ten because the winner of this game could represent the Western Division in the Big Ten and play either Ohio State or Penn State in Indianapolis in the Big Ten championship game. These games have huge playoff and New Year's Six Bowl implications. It's a big weekend for college football. This weekend will shape a lot of things going forward in the college football landscape. Will LSU or Bama prove to be the big dog in the SEC, especially the SEC West? You still have Georgia out there, though. Can Penn State stay undefeated, or do we have to start taking Minnesota serious? We'll see after this weekend. And since we're talking about Minnesota, let's talk about some undefeated teams who are kind of on the outside looking in, but they can make some noise and potentially put themselves in a position to make the playoff. Minnesota, they'll have to beat Penn State this week, and they have Iowa next week. That'll be a tough one. Iowa's a top 25 team. They have Northwestern, which they should win. And then the last game of the season, they have Wisconsin. That's a big game for them. 3 out of their last 4 games are against teams who are in the top 25 of the college football ranking. So it won't be easy for Minnesota, but if they could run the table, they are certainly putting themselves in position to go to the playoff if they go to the Big Ten championship and beat, say, Ohio State, or if Penn State beats Ohio State, they would have to play Penn State again. But I could also see them losing all 3 of those big games. They could lose 3 of their last 4. The game against Penn State could be a loss. Iowa and Wisconsin, those could all 3 be losses. And while we're talking highly of Minnesota now, had them in the top 25, if they lose those 3 games, they could be out of the top 25 by the end of the regular season. Now let's talk about Baylor in the Big 12. Baylor's undefeated. They've looked impressive so far. Matt Rhule has those guys playing very, very well. But they have to beat Oklahoma and Texas. They still have both teams on their schedule, OU and Texas. And despite the recent struggles for the Longhorns, that game versus Texas will not be easy. And I really don't see Baylor beating Oklahoma. Oklahoma had that loss against Kansas State. I think they're feeling motivated. Jalen Hurts, he's still putting up crazy numbers. I think Baylor's going in the right direction. The trajectory of the program is definitely going in the direction you will want if you're a Baylor fan. But I just don't see them beating Oklahoma. Oklahoma won't lose twice in the regular season. It's no way I can see them letting that happen, especially Jalen Hurts, knowing the leader that he is. He won't let Oklahoma lose to Baylor. Now let's get to some Heisman favorites at this point in the season. Like I said, you got to start with Joe Burrow. He has to be the leader in the clubhouse, if you ask me. 8-0. He's throwing for 2,805 pass yards, 30 pass touchdowns to just 4 interceptions, and is completing just under 79% of his passes. And he ran for 3 touchdowns on the season as well. Now let's go to the defensive side of the ball. Yep, this year is a chance a defensive player could take home the most coveted award in college football. Well, if you're talking about individual awards, of course, the national championship is the most important.
Yes, I'm talking about Ohio State's Chase Young. And as I was editing the podcast this morning, news broke that Chase was facing an indefinite suspension from the NCAA for some kind of violations. And so they said that he'll be out this week against Maryland and could potentially miss more games down the line. And so Chase went to Twitter and released a statement himself. I'll read it to you. It says, quote, "Unfortunately, I won't be playing this week because of an NCAA eligibility issue. I made a mistake last year by accepting a loan from a family friend I've known since the summer before my freshman year at OSU. I repaid it in full last summer, and I'm working with the university and the NCAA to get back on the field as soon as possible. I want to thank my family, teammates, coaches, and the whole Ohio State community for all the love and support. God bless and go Bucks." So now we know what the NCAA violation was, where it stemmed from. And shortly after Chase sent out that tweet, Bruce Feldman, who works for Fox Sports and The Athletic, tweeted out, and quote, "Speaking to an NCAA compliance expert on the Chase Young situation, here's what the expert said. If it is a loan he repaid and can prove it, 1 game suspension might be enough." End quote. So that's good news for Chase, good news for Buckeye fans who are optimistic, especially knowing that the Buckeyes are the top-rated team in the country right now and have the opportunity to make a playoff push. But I just wanted to throw that in there because I know I'm mentioning Chase Young as part of the Heisman race, but he will miss at least 1 game, potentially more down the line. But I had to get that in there. All right, now back to the Heisman candidates.
But he leads the country with 13 and a half sacks and 5 forced fumbles. He's the most dominant force in college football. He's the number 1 draft prospect, but that doesn't mean he'll go number 1 though, because a team with a QB need might be picking at the top of the draft. After Chase Young, let's talk about Tua. Tua's had a great season again, following up last season, really picking up where he left off. Of course, the season didn't end how he wanted to with that bad loss against Clemson, but regardless, he's putting up good numbers again this year. 2,166 pass yards, 27 pass touchdowns, 2 rushing touchdowns, and just 2 interceptions. He's looked good. He's not healthy all the way. He's not 100% healthy. He will play in that game. I know Coach Saban is saying he's a game time decision, but he's not going to miss that game against LSU. And if he has a big game, that could be a Heisman moment for him. And the SEC championship game is another big stage that could help him potentially win the Heisman or at least get that trip to New York. Jalen Hurts, you still got to have him in there. I know they lost to Kansas State, but before that, he was probably the leader in the clubhouse. He's thrown for 2,469 yards, 21 pass touchdowns, 3 interceptions, and he leads Oklahoma in rush yards with 181 yards and 13 rushing touchdowns. He's still putting up video game like numbers, like I said. Can you really count that against him? Should he really be penalized because the team, specifically his defense, couldn't get it done versus Kansas State? Back to the Buckeyes. We got 2 more Ohio State players who could potentially make the trip to New York and be a Heisman finalist. First, let's start with the quarterback, Justin Fields. He's looked great this season. It's his first full season as a starter. I didn't know how he'd perform, if he'd be shaky in some big moments, but he has really impressed me. His composure on the road in games where people are saying, "Oh, is this another Iowa or Purdue situation for Ohio State?" Fields has stayed calm, stayed in the moment, and led this team to victory each week. He has 1,689 pass yards, 24 pass touchdowns to just 1 interception, and is completing 69% of his passes. He also has 319 rushing yards and 9 touchdowns on the ground. Let's talk about his running mate in the backfield, J.K. Dobbins. He has 1,110 rush yards and 9 touchdowns, and he's averaging 7.2 yards a carry. Plus, he has 2 receiving touchdowns. Now, he could get overshadowed by his own teammates, Young and Fields, but Dobbins has definitely helped Fields. The leadership he has in the backfield, he's brought it every week. He's been there for the team. This is his 3rd season with over 1,000 yards. He's the only player in Ohio State history to have at least 1,000 yards in his first 3 seasons. Historic numbers in the big time program. So that's 3 Buckeyes who could potentially make the trip to New York, but they might cancel each other out. So we're at week 11. You have 4 more weeks of the regular season, and then it's to the conference championship games. It's been a fun college football season so far. If you ask me, it's been one of the more interesting in recent memory. Hasn't been a lot of big upsets. I mean, you have the loss by Georgia to South Carolina, and of course, Oklahoma lost to Kansas State. Two outcomes that we didn't see coming. But it happened, and that's the beauty of college football. That's really the beauty of all sports. Even if you're the favorite, you should win by 30 plus. You have to get out there and play the games, and you never know what'll happen. So that's the beauty of sports. But that's where we are here in the college football season so far. I'm excited to see how the end of the season goes. We got big time games coming up, big time players on big stages with opportunity to make a huge impact and potentially push their team to a championship push or even help themselves individually to win some of these end of the season awards. But that's all for this week. Thank you guys for tuning in to the 5 Seconds on the Clock podcast. We'll be back next week with more exciting content. Signing out for the 5 Seconds on the Clock podcast, it's your boy, Brandon Williams. Ya dig.